Welcome to No Compromises, a peek into the mind of two old web devs who have seen some things. This is Joel.
And this is Aaron.
Laravel gives you several different ways sometimes to accomplish a goal. And so I thought, and whenever there's a situation like that, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I was like, well, what's the right one? Like, what's the right way to do this? And sometimes right is just consistency, but sometimes there actually is a technical reason to do, or a team reason to do one versus the other. So let me make this concrete. Sometimes when you want a change to happen in response to some other change, you could do that, like by kicking off a job manually and making that change, firing an event, having a handler, whatever. Or you could use an observer that watches the model directly, and then it does its magic when that condition is met. And so I thought maybe we could talk through why we might choose one over another and what the trade-offs are.
So I think I'd make a clarification right away. I think the conversation we maybe want to have is between events and listeners and observers, because jobs are a thing that can be happening, but they are sometimes the byproduct of a listener or an observer or something, but they don't, they don't actually have a responsiveness nature to them.
Okay.
They're sent.
That's a fair distinction. So yeah, it would probably simplify the conversation a little bit too, to just frame it that way. Okay. So on one hand, you can manually fire an event and wire up a listener to do the work, or you can have this model observer that's kind of just there in the background and will do it automatically based on what happens.
So I think when you phrase it like that, it's still like, well, it's obvious, like which one you pick. But I think some of the things that Laravel gives us make that a little bit more muddied. Let's not talk about events and listeners specifically. I mean, broadly, let's go in specific. So there's actually a type of event that gets kicked off that you can wire up basically, or you can tell Eloquent is, I want you to issue this event when you've been updated or created or whatever. It's like a model event. And then there's also observers that can observe that these things have happened. So that's really, I think, where the confusion comes in. When we talk about events and listeners, unrelated to a model changing, I think that's pretty clear. Like I have an event, I issue an event, and then there's a listener to it. It's really more so, and that would be like in like a workflow. But this is really more so, I think, the conversation that we want to dig in on is, what if the thing that happens is directly related to some data changing on a model?
Okay. All right.
And I think that's where the confusion comes in, because Eloquent gives us the ability, like, again, so you can kick off and edit, like this model of an edited event, and you'd have to wire up a listener to that or not. Or you can have an observer that observes that model and has a method for like updated and watches that.
Can I throw out a concrete example, and maybe we can use that to sort of discuss it? All right. So let's say you have a system where a user can post jobs and other people apply to those jobs. So let's say when a user is deleted, they close their account. If they have an open job, you don't want those to be open anymore because they're not around anymore. So let's use that as a frame of reference. So would you fire an event in the endpoint that deletes the user or deactivates their account? Or would you make that a deleted event on the observer for the user model?
Right. It depends, again, on context. So that's why this is such an interesting conversation.
Yeah.
Let me give a rule first, and then let's apply it.
Okay.
If you have something that needs to happen in your system that is data specific, so if a piece of data changes, another piece of data has to change.
Right.
You can do that in two ways. You could do that like in your database with a trigger, or you could do it with an observer. I think that's the cleanest way. You're just saying a piece of data has changed, and I observe that, and here is a different piece of data that needs to change. And that's just kind of like, again, you said there's no right or wrong, but that's just kind of the ruling I use is if it's data only, I'll use an observer. If it's data and then I have to interact with a third party, maybe it's a combination of things. I might have an observer that changes the data, and then when it's done, it fires off an event that is more so like I've altered all the data necessary for this action. Now let's deal with third parties, because usually you don't want to deal with a third party until you have your own stuff kind of buttoned down.
Right.
And so I tend to use observers a lot in that case, because one of the things is if that data integrity is important. So I mean, if it's integrity, I don't want to force other developers or myself to remember that every time I delete that model, wherever it is, if it's in a command or if it's in a controller or whatever, that you have to remember to issue an event by hand.
Yeah.
Now
that's definitely a pro. So let's put that cleanly in the pro column, is like, you don't have to remember to do it. Maybe you're using something else like Nova that you can delete a user, and you don't have to remember to do it there too. So that's a clear win for the observer approach.
I mean, you could also say that, well, instead of using observer, you can tell Eloquent then to fire off that event. You can specify events in an array. I just think there's a lot of extra work, because basically if you're in there, you're pretty much saying make an event. So you have to create an event class, and you have to create a listener. Yeah. So like if you made one for each one of the actions, well, you just made a bunch more extra events that you really don't need. So just put it all in one class, use it as an observer. And the chances are, in my opinion, probably in most cases, that if you're making an observer that has to do with data integrity and moving stuff around and edited, created, all that kind of stuff, there's probably a little bit of code reuse that's going to happen there as well. Okay. So if you have it all in one class, it's just easy. It's all obvious.
Yeah. And so I'll just interject, because, one of the things that I maybe struggle with or don't like about observers is they can kind of feel hidden or magical. Like if you're looking at the model, if you're just looking at the model class, there's no hint this other action is happening. And if you just look at a controller that's changing the model, there's no hint it's happening. And so I think that is I would say a minor inconvenience, but there's probably other ways to solve that. And some of it is just knowing the system. You can look at the event service provider and see what observers are wired up. And I would say too, you probably don't use them for a lot. So it's not like you have 50 observers you have to keep track of. You certainly wouldn't have one for every model in your system. That would be very unusual, I think.
Well, and so that's a good point, is you shouldn't not know what code does, but the idea, or you shouldn't not know what like a code, like what happens in your system. Yeah. But the way I look at it is like the idea of like the observer is simple things that it doesn't matter if you know it anyway. Like, if you're going to delete a user, one would assume their jobs are not available.
Right.
I don't really know how that happens, and I don't really care most of the time.
Yeah.
Until like I have to troubleshoot it. Well, that's different though, because then you're in the mindset of like actually looking at it. But yeah, I mean, I get what you're saying, because that does bother me too. And like I said, there's other ways to solve it. It could be as simple as, even saying on the comments of your model, this has an observer. If it's really becomes a problem.
Right. Yeah, I think it's more of an imaginary problem, or it might. Like, especially in that debugging mode, you might be kind of temporarily a little confused, but it's really not that hard to figure out. It's certainly within the norm of a Laravel framework application. It's not like you're doing some completely crazy thing that some other person would never guess you were doing. Right. So in that context, I think it's fine. And it's a minor inconvenience, but outweighed by the data integrity aspects.
Yeah. So I'm not also saying that events and listeners don't have their place, because they do.
Sure.
I think the events and listeners are more based around, I reach for them in two instances. First, when it's like a workflow process that I'm marking the start or the end of, and there's probably a single way to get into that workflow and a single way to get out of it. So when you talk about like deleting a model and handling other data, there's a bunch of ways to get into there. But there's usually only one way to, I don't know, authenticate or register. There's a couple sort of, or like if you have a service that does a thing that is unique. Like when I post a job, I also post it on these 3 websites and I make them pay for it and all this stuff. There's probably only one way that that's ever done. Yeah. And so you could issue events at the beginning and the end of that. And then the other reason I might reach for events and listeners and those sort of things is when there is a many to many sort of relationship within what has to happen, or what could have caused this, or what needs to happen when a thing is caused. So a lot of times we have a single event and a single listener wired up, but that doesn't mean it has to be like that. You can have 3 events that all have the same listener, or you can have an event that has 3 listeners. There's reasons besides, maybe data integrity is for observers perhaps, and then workflow stuff is for events and listeners, the way I kind of look at it.
Yeah, I like that. And yeah, that's sort of like when I look at what Laravel itself does, like you mentioned auth and registration, that workflow fires events that you can then
Hmm.
hook into, listen to, and do things. Like you could like log in, for example, or verified. That is changing the model, but it would feel really weird to make that an observer and like
Hmm.
stick logic there, like, if last login at changes, do this thing instead of just listening to like an authenticated event or something like that.
Yeah. Okay. So as we kind of said in the beginning, there's no right or wrong way.
Mhm.
And then Joel used my favorite word when we started out, which is consistency.
Oh,
So always doing things consistent as much as you can, and also having kind of a reason for it. So if you're not sure whether you should be reaching for an observer or event or whatever, it's half the technology and half your decision making process. So if you're unsure, just take that moment then in this project to think it through and say, how am I going to use events and listeners, and how am I going to use observers? And I mean, I guess that could change too, but start out having an idea and kind of try
mhm.
to stick with that. And then the last thing I'll put to is like, don't be afraid to write it down in the README of the project. Have a section that kind of says, this is why I do things this way. I have that in a lot of my projects because I changed my thoughts over the years.
Mhm.
And when I go to it, I'm just like, oh, why am I doing it this way? Or a new programmer comes in and
Yeah.
they don't know your logic,
Mm-mm.
so they can take a look at that and at least they know what you're doing and maybe they can ask you questions. I sometimes have a hard time sleeping. I think a lot of people do. And you get these weird thoughts. Well, maybe not a lot of people, but some of us do. You get these
Okay.
weird thoughts in your head and it gets stuck in your head. And you're like, I just wish I could stop thinking and just go back to sleep. But I'm like, no, the more I push against it, the more like the thought won't go away. So I'm like, I just have to think this through.
Mm.
So I started thinking about what if you were invisible?
Okay.
And if you close your eyes, could you still see then?
Oh, is it like outward facing invisibility as well as inward facing?
Yeah, like is it like a one-way or two-way mirror? I mean, like how does that work when people are invisible? So yeah, if you close your eyes, can you see out? Can you see yourself, but people can't see you?
Hmm. I'm a little more worried about if closing your eyes, you can still see. I feel like that would drive you to never be able to sleep and would make your sleep problems worse. Like you
Yeah.
can't close your eyes.
Well, these things aren't related. I'm not saying be like you said your sleep problems worse. Like I don't think I don't think the invisible person was the person here with the sleep. I was saying I was having
Aaron,
the
are you
problem.
confessing that you have invisibility right now?
Yeah. I don't know if everyone knows this, but when someone downloads our book, it blows up Joel's phone. So you should probably go do that.
Very funny, Aaron. But if you want to do it, you can go to masteringlaravel.io and find all of our books.